Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host and moderator. I'm also the creator and the publisher of TheChocolateLife.com. Today, I have a very, very special guest, an innovator and explorer of cacao flavors and cacao fermentation, Bertus Eskes, who's connecting today from, I believe, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And before I bring Bertus on the line, what I'd like to do is I'd like to point out, number one, that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is sponsored by the members of TheChocolateLife.com. If you're not already a member, please go there, join. While you're watching the video, if you find it interesting, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. And whether you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook, go into the comments. If you have a question or a comment, if you have a question for Mr. Eskes, if you have anything you'd like to say about this, or just give us a quick shout out, where in the world you are connecting from, just put it in the comments. We'll get the shout out up on screen. The questions asked, hopefully answered over the course of the hour, right? So that's where we're going to go and begin. And with that, let's just dive right into it. Bertus, thank you for joining me today on this episode of Pod Save Chocolate.
Thank you very much. Clay, just to say one word, you needed a small title. I just say to the public that what I'm going to talk about is sublime cocoa by pulp selection and by advanced fermentations.
Right. Yes, I'm presented with all of those words, and I have a very, very short, limited ability within the software to use a title that long. All right. And so I needed to find a way of introducing that in a way that would get people here. And I think that the concept of reimagining fermentation, right, is, what do we mean by reimagining fermentation? And now you can go, okay, sublime cocoa through pulp selection we can get to that. I hope that's okay with you. Before we jump, we do have a comment already. We've got Thomas Forbes. Tom has been a longtime member of the Chocolate Life and a supporter here. Thank you very much, Tom, who's connecting from Bergen County, New Jersey. And Bertus, Thomas, in a comment said that he's been following your work for quite some time and is very, very intrigued and is interested in learning more about what's going on. Right. So what I want to do is actually introduce today's topic. And the way I want to do it is to set up a background for Bertus that people can connect with. And the first thing is that many people may not know, right, is that Bertus is in fact the person who came up with the idea and initiated the entire Cocoa of Excellence program. So this is back in 2007, 2008, 2009. Right? So this notion of recognizing flavor excellence in cacao is something that Bertus has been working on for now, over 15 years in terms of setting up the Cacao of Excellence program. Also, you may not be aware of this, but what you have done is you may actually have tasted some of the results of his work indirectly. So if you have ever tasted a chocolate that is produced by what Valrhona calls their double fermentation method, doubly fermented, then what you're actually doing is you're tasting cocoa, which has been processed using a technique that Bertus invented, which is called trop mix. And not only did he develop it, but he patented it. And before I bring Bertus back on to discuss this, what I want to do is I want to say the reason why I chose this particular image for today, right? So reimagining fermentation. This is a photograph that was in the Knapp book, Plantation from Cacao from the Plantation to the Consumer by Knapp, which was originally published in the 1920s, I believe. And this shows big box fermentation in a cascade being done on the island of Java in the 1920s. And when we talk about reimagining fermentation, what I want you to talk about, Bertus, is have we been fermenting cacao incorrectly all this time? Have we been thinking about how to go about fermenting cacao wrong since the beginning? And that's a big, hairy, audacious goal for today's episode. But I think that's where I want to start.
May I comment? Traditional fermentation for me has several flaws. One of the most important flaws is you cannot get rid 100% of bitterness, you cannot get rid of acidity. Certainly, there's always a small percentage of beans that are not well fermented, maybe 5%, 10%, that are black beans and that have not received any fermentation. And then the other flaw is very difficult to repeat the results. In Brazil here, my farmer colleagues, friends, they say 1 out of 4, 1 out of 10 fermentation is okay. But then the others is difficult to repeat what you get once. So I was working on improving fine cocoa, improving bulk cocoa into fine cocoa. According to ICCO, fine cocoa shows other than cocoa flavor. Bulk cocoa only shows cocoa flavor. So my whole work was to transform bulk into fine cocoa.
So I want to be very, very clear about the startup premise is that most of the cocoa that is fermented around the world today is in fact still fermented by smallholder farmers. It is not done at a large post-harvest processing center. I mean, I believe that's still true in Brazil as well, correct?
Most cocoa in the world is not fermented at all because there's no price difference. I've worked with non-fermented cocoa in Brazil because it was less bitter than fermented cocoa. I was very surprised. If I did a special treatment that I invented, I'm not going to talk about, I could change the unfermented cocoa in acceptable cocoa.
Okay, but I think that the point that I want to talk about here is that when we do talk about cocoa that is fermented, so we're not talking about, for example, the cacao lavado, which is washed unfermented cocoa in like the state of Tabasco, Mexico. So that's not what we're talking about, right? Most of the fermentation that is being done is what we might call, the method of my grandfather, abuelito. So I'm fermenting the way my grandfather fermented. And my grandfather is fermenting the way his grandfather fermented. And we don't know when the process of fermentation was first discovered and commercialized on large scale, right? But we do have this notion, as I think you point out, it's really, really important. I've been struggling for quite some time on how do I define specialty cocoa as opposed to bulk or commodity cocoa. And I think that in our conversation earlier this week, setting up for this episode, that using that ICO definition, the ICCO, the International Cocoa Organization, is that a bulk or commodity cocoa can only express, right, cocoa flavors, with cocoa and chocolate flavors, right? And that's what we're looking for. And then when we think about specialty cocoa, or what people call cacao fino y de aroma, so fine and flavor cocoa, we're talking about cocoa that can express other flavors, fruit, flowers, for example, vegetal notes. Those are the things. And when it comes to chocolate connoisseurs, those are the flavors that we preferentially seek out over just straight plain chocolate flavor. I just want to make sure for the people who are watching this that we understand that that's what that baseline is. Now, I understand that part of your research, going back into, 20 years or more, is that you've discovered that there is a connection between the flavors in the pulp and the flavors in cocoa, right?
Yes,
and
I was working for a big project, working in 12 different cocoa countries, and like a monkey, I'm eating pulp everywhere I go, and I discovered that the best pulp was in countries that produce the best chocolate, especially Ecuador and Trinidad. Ecuador got at that time 100% bonus. Trinidad got 200% bonus. And the pulp is very delicious. Then my friends at Syrah did not believe me. They said that the flavors and aromas are born in the fermentation. And so I invented drop mix. I showed that when I put fruits in the pulp, the chocolate will absorb the fruit taste. And that was my patent in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
So
So in your book, and let me share for a moment your book here. This is the cover of your book, and I want to let everyone know that if they go to this post on TheChocolateLife.com, so this is the post for today's episode, and they scroll down, there is a link to a file download for Phenomenal Cocoa. So if you click on this link, you will be able to download at no cost Bertus's book, this book called Phenomenal Cocoa. Right. So I just want to let everybody know that this is done. And I believe that here in the book, one of the things you do, Bertus, is you talk about, I think you said you identified 6 different pulp flavors and aromas, right, which are distinguishable in the cocoa that is produced by one of your fermentation methods. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you go to fine cocoa, the definition of ICCO, then you have citric acidity, then there is caramel, then there is nut, then there is fresh, and there is mature fruit, and there is spicy, and then there is floral. Mm-hmm. 6 out of these 7 are born in the pulp. I learned to identify pulp flavors and aromas, and this is very important if you want to select for a new variety. Remarkable pulp flavors turned out to be remarkable chocolate flavor. My first experience was in Trinidad in 2010. In the middle of a Trinitario plantation, I found one tree that had a pure banana flavor. We took the fruits, 10 different fruits, and add wine, did the fermentations. The chocolate was delicious. It was a mature banana flavor, like a jelly, banana jelly. So that showed to me that if I could find other remarkable pulp flavors, we would have other remarkable varieties. That's what I did a large part of my life.
So, this actually brings out an interesting question, and I think it's a myth that is often repeated, and perhaps you can help me dispel it here, which is that many people believe that if your cacao trees grow near banana trees, that the chocolate made from that cacao will have the flavor of banana. And I think that's a misconception. I mean, and based on what you're saying, those flavors come from the pulp, not from the fact that there's a tree nearby. Is that correct?
Yes, it's fake news. When in Peru, I found a mandarin here. Then 1 kilometer away from it, I find another mandarin pulp. I found 6 mandarin pulps, nothing to do with a tree of mandarin that was nearby.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And in total, I have now found 50 different flavors and aromas. It's impossible to have 50 different nearby trees that will all influence this trait.
Great. No, I understand. And, for many people who have never been to a producing country, who are really, really interested in cocoa and chocolate, I recommend that you go to a producing country and that you have the opportunity to go to some sort of germplasm bank or other place where you have lots of different cacao growing in the same vicinity. Bertus, I'm sure you've done, something like this, but when I was in Peru in 2015, we were outside Chizuta, which is near Tarapoto in San Martin province. And we had a chance to go through just row after row of trees. So there was one variety, we pull a pod off it, and like the pulp has this one flavor. And then we go one row over and there's another variety, and it has a pulp that tastes entirely different. The balance of sweetness, the balance of fruit, the balance of floral, all these other things are just very, very different. And I think that
you are a monkey like me.
Well, I would say that I am curious right? And I want to say, from a personal experience, I was in Mexico, I want to say in 2017, and I was there with Stefan Bona, and we were at the research station in Huimanguillo at INIFAP, and we have all these pods from the germplasm bank that is on the station. And Stefan is tasting the pulp, and he's going, I can imagine that just based on the pulp, that this would be an interesting cocoa for me to consider, right? So I just wanted to say there's sort of independent corroborative evidence that I have personally experienced by someone who knows a great deal about this, who makes the decision about what cocoa to buy based upon the flavors that are in the pulp that they put together, the flavors in the pulp that they discern, right, through the
Clay, I endeavored to publish in 2012 the relationship between pulp and chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
I never had more than 50 people reading my work for each publication. This one was 5,000.
Okay, so hopefully
nobody asked me one question. Nobody proposed me anything. They must be thinking that I am mad.
Well, so my personal experience says that you're not mad, right? And because I've had this corroborative evidence of doing it. But what I think it does is, I think one of the challenges is that people say, well, this is the way we've been fermenting for the last more than 120 years, right? And why would we change that? So there's a whole lot of inertia based upon, well, I now have to learn an entirely new method. Maybe I need to use an entirely new set of equipment. There's this entirely different way of thinking about things, right? And when we think about, big chocolate, they say, well, we're really happy with the way things are because all of our recipes, from where the cocoa comes from to how we roast it, to how, the amount of sugar we add, to how we conch it or not conch it, to how we're alkalizing it, right? All of that is based on cocoa the way it is. We don't want the cocoa to change, right? So what happens is it becomes that, the people who are likely to watch an episode like this, which is we're interested in what we would call specialty cocoa and chocolate made from specialty cocoa, right? That's got all these wonderful sets of flavors. This is where we can get adoption, right? And do something new and interesting. Before we go, what I want to do is we have Nathan Pinto who's watching, and he says, hi, Bertus and Clay. And then Thomas says, yeah, so in the Dominican Republic, around 50% of the cocoa is unfermented, what's called Sanchez, as opposed to Hispaniola, which is the name given for fermented cocoa. So let's jump in, if we can, Bertus. So before we do that, if you're watching, you've got a question or a comment, get it into the live chat on YouTube or in the comments in Facebook and LinkedIn. We'll get it up on screen. And if you do have a question, we can ask it for Bertus. So here is a question from Freddy Amores, Bertus, from a high-yielding cacao variety in Ecuador, he's talking about Ep 802, or I would say T802. I have tasted the sweetest pulp I've ever had. Once well fermented, the flavor of chocolate has nut and sweetish notes. Right. So, Freddie, if you can, give us an idea about if there are any other flavor notes. But are you familiar? I mean, I know, Bertus, you're going to be going to Ecuador shortly for cacao, which is organized by Ana Cacao. Are you familiar with these new varieties coming out of Ecuador? T801, T802, and what their genetics and what their flavor potential is. Are you familiar with them?
I happen to give about $100,000 a year to Freddie to have more space, to use more varieties, to make more crosses. And one of those varieties came out of it was 802.
Gotcha. So I was in Ecuador about 2 years ago. I may be going back in November. But what I want to is, so my understanding is that, CCN 51, the number 51, so we have collection Castro Naranjal, was really all about productivity and disease resistance. And they really weren't thinking about flavor, when they come to it. But when you ferment CCN51 sort of conventionally, you end up with something which would not be considered fine and flavored cocoa by most of the world, right? You have something which is, as a matter of fact, not very good at all, right? But my understanding, from when it comes to the new tea varieties, 801 and 802, that what they've done is they've done that next generation of hybridization, looking for the disease resistance and the productivity, which is found in CCN51, but specifically looking at how do we create something which delivers a fine and flavor cocoa, a specialty cocoa, according to ICCO. Is that correct?
To my understanding, nearly all varieties in the world are fine cocoa varieties, but you destroy the fine varieties by using traditional methods of fermentation, which you have to correct afterwards. So my quest is to transform bulk varieties into fine varieties. We will talk about it a little bit later. Just to mention, the CCN51 has a citric lemon aroma or flavor, and the jasmine aroma. Both appear in my fermentations. They are not the best in the world, but they are good. They are good.
Well, I think that's also one of the things that's very interesting is if you actually look at the genetics of CCN51, right, there is some traditional Arriba Nacional. I mean, there are the Nacional genetics in CCN51. I mean, it is a forastero hybrid, right? And when we think about the traditional flavor, the Arriba flavor, which is associated with Nacional, we think of orange blossom and jasmine. So it's not surprising to me that those flavors are there, right? And the CCN51 pulp there's a lot of it.
The genetics, there are 3 clones. One is coming from Trinidad. All the Trinitario have jasmine clay. And the one we don't know is a wild cocoa coming from the Amazon, which I never tasted. I don't know what it has.
Gotcha. So let's step back. If you could think of one component of your 3 fermentation methods, right? Trop mix, anima, and tratema, right? What is if you can, the single insight that differentiate those fermentation methods from conventional fermentation?
When I started, do you want to talk about fermentation now, or shall we continue a little bit more on the flavor, on the pulp, because that's very interesting as well. But just quickly on the differentiation, I was happy to never have studied cocoa fermentation. I was not inhibited by any knowledge which would not help me anywhere. I'm shocked to see that on starter cultures there are more than 30 publications worldwide, and the lady in Brazil that did work for it the whole life did a review, and she concluded that sometimes it works and sometimes it does not work. Mm-hmm. Do I need to use that in my information to advance? I took a completely new road to fine flavor fermentation.
Right. But I suppose one question that people come to me with and they talk about, okay, what is the key insight, right, that informs your method? So if we look at trop mix, for example, one of the things about the trop mix fermentation is that what you're doing is you're adding flavoring elements, fruit flavoring elements. I can throw peach, or I can throw some other fruit, maybe papaya, mango, something like that, which is local, into the fermentation pile. And what will happen is that the cocoa beans during fermentation will absorb the chemicals associated with those flavors. And when I make the chocolate will express those flavors. Now, that's very simplistic, but is that about correct?
No, exactly. You're right. That's easy to explain. Anima and tratema, I would have more difficulty to explain. Anima is nearly a mystery. There can be 10 PhD studies done on anima to explain what's going on. What I'm doing in anima is accelerating the fermentation from 6, 7 days to 2, 3, 4 days, depending on the variety. And at the same time, the bitterness goes away. So after 3 days, I have a cocoa which has no bitterness and no acidity. This is completely new to the fermentation world.
And my understanding is because of the way the fermentation proceeds, that the distribution of fermentation is more even. So in a conventional fermentation, especially if you're doing it in a square box, the edges, the deep edges tend to be colder and the fermentation is not even. And so that's why we talk about something like 80% well fermented, because we have 20% beans that are either unfermented, slaty, or are partially fermented. And it is those unfermented and partially fermented beans that contribute the chemicals that we associate, for example, with astringency.
Anima cocoa is 100% fermented. All beans taste the same. No way to use cut test. Cut test is false for Anima. Anima has dark beans because it does not blood as much as other cocos. If there's less blooding, you know, okay. The sangre, less blooding makes that the bean inside become darker. But the inside of that bean has more flavor and aroma. I want that. So
what I think is very, very interesting here is that this is something that I learned when I was working in Nicaragua, which is that there is a standard which we think of as 80% well fermented, right? And that is something that comes from West African cocoa. It comes from bulk and commodity cocoa. It comes from what the cut test was created for. The cut test was created to look at the distribution of fermentation to say, oh, is the distribution of fermentation of this cocoa the same as the last harvest? So I can use this cocoa in recipes that I already have. I don't need to change them, right? But if I could say that, you know, many sophisticated...
Anima is not only 100% fermented by taste, but also by the openings. The openings in the cotyledons are 100% open. So,
what they call fissuring yes, in English. Yes, the fissuring. But the point I wanted to make here is that, you know, there were professional cocoa traders who would look at some of this cocoa coming out of Nicaragua and they'd say, you know, the cut test says it's only 38% well fermented, and therefore we can't buy it. It's bad cocoa. But as you point out, it is the chemicals, for example, that contribute to color in the beans, right? That contribute to interesting flavor. If the only color in the bean once it's fermented and dried is brown, right, then all you're going to get is brown flavors, right? And you want these partially fermented or differently fermented beans in the mix in order to be able to have the chemicals which contribute to all these fun flavors that we look for.
It's not a good method. Cut test is not useful, not at all for me and not for even traditional fermentation. You have to taste. No, the big problem in cocoa is that nobody tasted the bean. I started tasting beans from the beginning. You know what you're doing, but everybody thinks the bean is very bitter. So they are right. They should not taste the bean. But if you don't do it, you will never improve.
I agree with you, right? You know, for example, when I talk to chocolate makers, I say, listen, you might start off making a 2-ingredient chocolate, just cocoa beans and sugar, but start off making a more conventional chocolate and then pare down the ingredients so that you can know what you're doing compared with something else. I mean, if you are a chocolate maker and you are not, you know, going to the farm and tasting fresh beans and then tasting them during fermentation and then tasting them the dried and then tasting them in the chocolate, then you have an incomplete understanding of the process. And Bertus, if I can, for me, I think the fundamental insight which you brought to the Cacao of Excellence program, right? And I want you to know also the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Project, which is built upon the work because it's Ed Seguin and Darren Suke. It's, you know, pretty much the similar groups of people, is that what they're doing is they're saying, we are going to judge the cocoa beans in part based upon the chocolate that it makes. These cocoa beans make interesting chocolate, and therefore what we want to do is we want to understand more about what's special about these cocoa beans, right? But that fundamentally there is this relationship back and forth between those two things. We have to understand the fact that these two things are connected, and what we want to do is we want to understand the way these things are connected, right? But because you're here, why were you motivated to create the Cocoa of Excellence program back in 2008, 2009? Where did this idea come from, and why do we have it today?
I worked for CFC, Cocoa of Excellence, a program that was sponsored by ICCO as well. There was a midterm evaluation, and the coffee Cup of Excellence had just started, and they received money from CFC to start. And I said, CFC, why don't you support cocoa initiative on Cocoa of Excellence, the name that I chose to start the thing? And they very quickly approved, ICCO approved. In the first year, I got 150 farmers. I contacted all the institutions. But the main reason, Clay, is that I was a farmer. As a farmer, I invented drop mix. I wanted to get a prize in an international competition. And there was no international competition to win a prize for a farmer. So the big thing of Cocoa of Excellence is that we get things done for farmers. Farmers get on the foreground. And unfortunately, after I left, they cut the possibility of drop mix beans to be presented. Nothing. Only chocolate makers are allowed to add inclusions, and they do that 80% in fine cocoa. Farmers are not allowed to do that. They are not allowed to get a prize with what they are adding to their cocoa.
So that sounds to me like a strange, so it does sound strange at one level, but on the other level, if what you're trying to say is this cocoa, they're looking at understanding, right, the underlying potential, not a potential which has been manipulated in some way. So, but I could imagine that cocoa which is produced using either the anima or tradema methods would be acceptable in the Cocoa of Excellence.
Yes.
Is that correct? Because you're not adding anything into the fermentation pile. But it's interesting. Does Cocoa of Excellence accept inoculated fermentations? I haven't thought about that.
No.
Right.
You cannot add anything.
Okay.
You cannot use starter culture. You cannot use anything.
So they're using wild fermentations. And so I want to let everybody know, one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is that when we think about reimagining fermentations, when I talk about my work down in Nicaragua, I also worked in Mexico on this, is that when people think about scientific fermentation, they think about what I think of as technified fermentation. What we're doing is we're using an understanding of chemistry, right, to control variables in fermentation. So I'm going to measure, for example, the sugar level and acidity of the pulp when I collect the cacao and baba, the wet mass, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to understand what the pH of the cotyledons is, the beans is. And then I'm going to measure during fermentation changes in sugar level and pH and temperature during fermentation. And I'm going to make decisions about when to turn based upon measurements, right? I'm also going to go take a look at a biological understanding, so the microbiome of the fermentation. So what yeasts and what bacteria, right, are present and dominate, what mix dominates in any particular location. And understanding those, I can say that, well, these yeasts and these bacteria are going to generate these kinds of flavors. And I can control the amount of time, right, in any given, before I turn the cocoa, right, in order to be able to control the final flavor, which I think, Bertus, you'd recognize is the approach that, technified fermentation takes.
So my technified fermentation is my mouth. I don't need to every day. With experience, we know more or less when anima is terminating, when tradima is terminating, and then you have at noon you may have still 3 or 4 bitterness, and at 6 o'clock in the night it's 0 bitterness. That's when you stop your fermentation and you put it to dry. So, but you have to be there with your mouth. Otherwise, you will miss the right. You will over ferment or you will under ferment.
So the technical equipment that you're using to determine is your mouth. It's a trained taster.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Bitterness, I think everybody can assess.
Right. No, I understand. But rather than taking the cotyledons out of the fermentation pile and then peeling them and grinding them and diluting them in distilled water and putting them in a pH meter, you're not doing that.
No,
right?
in traditional fermentation, I think there's a reason to do that. And my method of mouth does not work because even after 6 days, you still have a lot of acidity and you still have a lot of bitterness. You will have no conclusion from eating the beans.
Again, I want to let everybody know that if you're expecting to understand exactly how to incorporate either the tradima or anima fermentations on your farm, Bertus is not going to reveal those secrets to you here, much as we might like him to. What I am going to do is on the post for today's episode. So we'll go to the post for today's episode. What I'm going to do is I will put a link to Bertus, an email link to Bertus. And if you're interested in contacting him, you can contact him and say, hey, I would like to work with you to add these fermentations into my post-harvest protocol. Right? So you'll be able to figure it out. Bertus has invested many years of his life and significant amount of money in producing these protocols. And he is looking to get some return, right? Is that fair to say, Bertus?
Yes.
Okay. So what I want to talk about other aspects of this, which I think are interesting. So you have in the anima and tradima methods, right, techniques which appear to be able to consistently reduce the amount of time it takes to fully ferment your cocoa. Is that correct?
Anima 3 to 5 days, tradima 3-4 days.
So but conventional fermentations take 6 to 7 days.
Yeah, anima changes depending on the variety. It changes depending on the pulp. Like anima is reading what is needed to become ready, and it may be 3 days, it may be 4 days. CSCN 51 used to be 4 or 5 days.
I understand that, but what I wanted to do is point out that if a traditional fermentation is at 6 to 7 days conventionally, right, and then your methods consistently take less time, then number one, there's less labor involved, and therefore they're less expensive, and they might also present less risk to the farmer, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, at the same time, what is happening is that they are completely reducing bitterness, completely reducing astringency, and completely reducing acidity in the dried beans.
Yes.
Correct. Now, this is something you shared with me. So my understanding is that when cocoa makes it into the chocolate factory, so a big chocolate factory, that depending upon the finished product, somewhere between 10% and 30% of manufacturing costs are getting rid of bitterness, astringency, and acidity.
Even more, 12 to 36.
12 to 36%. Okay. And one of the main methods for reducing acidity, which is alkalization, right, is number one, expensive, it's time consuming. And what it does is it destroys the nutritional profile of the cocoa.
It loses 80% in polyphenols.
Yeah. Depending upon the variety, depending upon which base you're using, what the contact time is, what the concentration is, it's not a straight line. It's like
It
depending
varies.
on the chemicals you're
It
measuring,
varies.
right? But so one of the things that this suggests is that by using the anima and tradema methods, we could completely eliminate the need for alkalization of cocoa,
Yes.
which is mind-boggling in some respect. So the question becomes, if what I want to do is let's say that I'm a cooperative, right? And I have a bunch of farmers, right? And some of my farmers are far enough away that getting wet cocoa mass to a central collection point for post-harvesting is difficult, right? Could I do the anima and tradema methods using a 5-gallon bucket? So like an 18-liter bucket. Is that possible?
I do anima between 10 to 500 liters. That's what I did.
And here's an interesting question. I mean, I think conventional wisdom says that I want at least 100 kilos of wet mass in order to do a good fermentation. But I know that a 50-kilo box is going to be a different fermentation than a 250-kilo box. So in your experience, is the fermentation results using your methods the same, irrespective of the size of the box?
My good colleagues in Syrah always told me minimum size of box is 50 by 50 by 50. I could never reach what I reached without using boxes, polystyrene boxes of 10, 12 liters, because I can do 40 experiments in 1 week. If I have to use the big box.
If you use big boxes, you need a
lot
more.
All of them fermented well.
Yeah. And I think more importantly, that independent of the size of the container, they ferment the same. It's still 100% fermented, right? Exactly. It is still free of bitterness, astringency, and acidity.
The process is the same.
Okay. So, Thomas, I didn't know the secret. And the answer to the question is, yeah, Bertus is very careful at revealing the secret. There is a secret, right? There is some secret sauce in the method that he does not reveal generally. So there is that. And then you couldn't quite understand, yes, there is a secret, right? And I want to let you know is that he hasn't shared it with me either. I don't know what the secret is for doing it.
I'm sorry to say,
yeah.
Even cocoa is a secret to me.
So I would say yes, that anybody who believes that they know everything about cocoa or chocolate is like completely confused about the complexity of it, right? And that no matter what you know, there is still more to know. So Coco has revealed some of her secrets to you, right? But perhaps not all of her secrets.
Clay, just to add, that anima is cheap and easy to do. You don't need to buy anything from outside the farm. No investment.
So it's just tweaking something here, something there. Yeah.
Change your method and your mind.
Right. Well, I think that first you have to change your mind in order to be willing to change your method. And so, I think that talks about something that's really, really important here that we can, go through over sort of the last quarter of the episode. And by the way, we're 45 minutes in. This has gone just like really, really quickly. So, it seems to me that there are a lot of sort of structural advantages to doing this. Number one is I don't need any new equipment. I don't need any new technique, right? It is adaptable to different scales, right? Which is unusual, right? But it requires changing the method. So if my grandfather has been doing it this way and his grandfather was doing it this way, I need to be convinced to do it differently. Now, and the question is, why is it being so difficult to convince people that this is faster, cheaper, less risk in using this method. Why do you think that's the case, Bertus?
I think it's very difficult for people to think outside the box. When I started Anima, I have to say thanks to Kristen Hart. She was with me in Peru in 2012. And she said, Bertus, something fundamentally is wrong with fermentation. And she, using her intuition, I followed her intuition and I found Anima. So if you only think within the box, you will never improve. That's why 200 years of fermentation did never change.
Or perhaps 500 years of fermentation. I said, right, has never changed. So, but it's, again, it seems like to me, like the economic advantages are so great from a reduction of labor involved on the farm, from a reduction of risk. All right, the longer it's out there fermenting, the more likely I am to over ferment it and ruin something, right? And we talk about a change of anywhere between 10 and 36%, or 12 and 36% in manufacturing costs. It seems like the economics involved, right, are pretty unmistakable, right? That there is reason to go and adopt this thing. So do you think that the challenge is with big chocolate and the way they're constituted, right? Or is there some other challenge? I mean, do you find that farmers go, oh yeah, this makes sense to me, I want to go do this because it's better, right? So the resistance is not coming from the farm, the resistance is coming from upstream.
I found acceptance and lots of understanding from small and medium-sized farmers and chocolate makers. Difficult to get answer. I always inform the multinationals about what I'm doing. I don't even get an answer. I think they are very happy what they are doing. And they are right, because 80% of the world cocoa is terrible. Yeah. They cannot change one for the other. Now I think quality is not enough. You have to weigh quality and quantity. With quantity, they will get interested because they can adjust their machines to have 20 tons, a container, in 1 day finished. So that's what I'm now looking for. Maybe, Clay, let me tell about economic applications of Anima so far.
Please
about
do.
20 to 40 tons of Anima chocolate per year in 6 different countries. The biggest one is Côte d'Ivoire. Africa is taking the lead. My good friend Alain Kaplan has got a loan to produce 1,000 tons of Anima every year. And he's selling in Belgium. He's selling to the chefs in France. That is the beginning of the future of cocoa, of Anima.
So are these chefs in France, are they buying the cocoa or they're buying chocolate made from the cocoa?
Chocolate. The factory in Ivory Coast is chocolate factory.
Ah, so
Couverture.
Okay, so your friend Alain is working with farmers to ferment using the Anima method, and then is transforming that cocoa into couverture in Côte d'Ivoire, and then exporting that cocoa.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
One detail may be that all fine cocoa in the world, you need centralized fermentation. So that's what Alain organizes. He has hundreds and hundreds of small farmers that he gets the beans or the fruits and then they fermented in one place. And he said, every fermentation of Anima gives me the same result. That's another amazing thing.
Yeah, and again, when we talk about what it is that big chocolate is looking for, they're looking about consistency. So anybody who's watched Pod Save Chocolate or the Chocolate Life Live or reads The Chocolate Life understands that, I am of the opinion that there's no objective measure of quality, right? So, quality is a basket of attributes, and Bertus has, we may have the same attributes, but we value those attributes differently. And so for a big chocolate company, it may be that irrespective of what the quality is, I want the quality to be consistent. And then maybe price is another vast attribute.
And they want the quantity.
And then they need the quantity as well. And, that's a conversation that I've had with a well-known American chocolate maker who says when we go about thinking about bringing on a new producing country as an origin, we want to know that we can get a level of flavor potential, right? That's one way of describing quality. We want a flavor potential out of the chocolate. I can get the amount of that flavor potential. So if I need 100 tons a year, I need to know that I can get 100 tons a year of it, right? And I know that I can get that same flavor potential from harvest to harvest to harvest. And they won't bring on a new producing country, a new origin, until those factors are ones that can be guaranteed. And I think that's really important. But, Bertus, I think from an economic perspective, right, one of the things to consider is if I can reduce labor costs on the farm and I can reduce manufacturing costs in the factory, then it seems like there's a lot more room in the price equation, from the price of cocoa to the retail price, for the farmers to earn more. Right, to keep more of what's going on. Am I misunderstanding something there?
I wrote that in my book, 21.
Okay.
Yes, no, that's my aim. That's looking for that direction.
Well, that's certainly one aim, but what you've said is that one of your aims is, and you say this out loud, is you want to produce cocoa that would eliminate entirely the need for alkalization, Dutch processing. You just say, this is a bad idea. It was invented in the 1820s to chemically neutralize acidity because we didn't have any other way to do it.
By a Dutchman, and I am a Dutchman also.
Yes. Yeah, yes, that is a little bit, a Dutchman living in Brazil, right? And do they grow cocoa in Rio de Janeiro? Is it the state of Rio as well? I know Sao Paulo. I'm sorry?
In Rio, there's small farmers.
Okay.
Now they adopt to Anima, and everybody's happy.
Right. So I'm going to ask a really interesting question because, I'm really, really interested in experimental fermentations and, obviously highly technified fermentation. Although I realize that in a highly technified fermentation, what we may be doing is controlling variables wrong. We are controlling variables. We're able to get consistent results, but maybe they're not the variables that we should be controlling for. But are you familiar with a fermentation method out of coffee, right? Which is a 100% anaerobic fermentation that they're bringing over into cocoa? Have you heard about that?
I've heard from two sides. One is in Bahia, where about 5 years ago, a farmer developed barrels, 20 days, 12 days, 15 days fermentation without any air. Mm-hmm. Bitterness and acidity go away, but there's no taste. There's no flavor, no aroma. Okay. And I heard that from other, and I forgot where. There's another experience going on. It's Mars trying to patent the method like that.
I did hear that they're trying to take a method which is widely used and then put a patent on it. That's Mars for you. That's big chocolate for you. Let's take an invention. Let's take an invention that was put together through love and sweat and tears by smallholders and small inventors, and let's go and appropriate it. For example, the quote unquote Ruby process, right? That that Barry Callebaut introduced. That on the farm technology.
You mean Ruby or rubbish?
Yeah. I'm not making a value judgment about because there are some people who like it, right? So I'm not making a quality judgment. But the fact is that Barry Callebaut patented a process which they appropriated from the people who actually developed it. And so we get that. So I think that when you talk about Bahia, there is a farm called Capela Velha, so the old church, right, near Itacaré. That's where I first ran across it, right, when I was when we met in 2022 at Chocolate Bahia. I went and visited them.
Clay, let me say a few words about the pulp study.
Okay, let's close off. We have about 5 minutes left. Let's close off with a pulp study because I think that's a good place to go.
I'll do very quickly. So I discovered the value of remarkable pulp flavors and aromas. I did a survey in Peru, in Brazil, and in Cote d'Ivoire. The last one in Cote d'Ivoire was really revealing. 400 trees give me 100 different combinations of flavor and aroma. That means 100 different fine varieties. I did 50 chocolates out of the 100, confirming the flavor and aroma which was in the pulp in the chocolates. The mystery was I discovered that all the Cote d'Ivoire beans, all the Cote d'Ivoire trees are fine cocoa varieties, although it's called bulk and bulk and bulk. And I discovered why. I did anima, the little bit of bitterness what was in those fine varieties, this goes away in 2 days. With the traditional fermentation, the little bit of bitterness in the traditional fermentation goes up from 2 to 7 in 5 minutes in the box. The box of fermentation, traditional fermentation, is stressing the cocoa. It's the main reason why nobody else should use it again, and then it doesn't go away. It goes from 7 back to 5, and then it's finished. So that explains why cocoa in Cote d'Ivoire is bulk, and it also explains that 100% of Ivory Coast cocoa could be fine cocoa. This is my method, using my method. And we are working on that. My good friend Alain, is taking profit of it already now for 2 years.
So I have a question right now, is that I am going to be having a presentation at the end of October with the British Society of Flavorists.
Mm-hmm.
Right, it's going to be in Brussels at the European Flavor Association offices, and the topic is going to be the flavor of chocolate. That's the day-long symposium. Do you think it might be possible to get samples of your cocoa that I could share with the people at the symposium? Is there some place in Brussels where I might be able to get some?
But would you share it with 100 people, 200 people? Would be difficult.
Everybody who is in that everybody who comes to that symposium, I would share it with.
I will contact Alain. If he can send you a sample, you'll give me the address. I can send you some from Brazil. I have incredible samples from here.
All right, so I'm co-presenting with somebody who lives in Brussels, and we can use that as the delivery address between there. But I think it could be very, very interesting. So, but for everybody who might not be aware, I think there are a couple of things that are happening. Number one is that the primary variety which is transplanted into Cote d'Ivoire would have been a Melanado Forastero, right? So that's the bulk. And surprise, surprise, it originated in northeastern Brazil, right? So I believe in the state of Pará or maybe up in that area.
But to complete the hybrid that I work with is crosses between Peruvian and Amalonado. Yep. And the hybrids are finer than Criollo cocoa. Criollo does not have bitterness. The hybrids, 50% does not have bitterness. Mm-hmm. I have worked with them without fermentation, and I get excellent chocolate. I don't need to ferment.
So what I want to do is I want to talk about, again, this notion of finer, right? As we talk about flavor potential, and they had talk about, I think, different flavor potential. And again, some people value some flavor and some people value other flavors. So I think it's important that we stay away from like superlatives, right? In talking about this, that what we want to do is we want to say, what is your definition of the flavor you want in your chocolate? And how can we go and produce cocoa beans that will give you that flavor in the quantity you want at the level of consistency? So, I think that, one of the things that I want to do with this discussion is put that framing on things, just so you know, Bertus.
Happily, everybody has another taste.
Absolutely. I mean, that it's important. But there's another really important thing going on here, which I want to point out to people, is that if, anybody who has spent any time in a kitchen cooking with a really, really competent chef knows that, if I slightly increase or decrease the acidity that in my recipe, so I add more lemon juice, for example, or less lemon juice, or I add acidity in the form of vinegar as opposed to a fresh fruit juice, right? That what I'm going to do is I'm going to mask some flavors, right, or reveal other flavors, right? So if I add salt, number one, the tongue is more receptive to some flavors, but the saltiness may mask other flavors. So if I increase the sweetness, I'm going to mask the bitterness, which is what chocolate is all about. If I add vanilla, it's called a masking aroma, and I'm going to hide defects in the chocolate. And so I think the point being that I want people to take away from this aspect of it is that by reducing bitterness, reducing astringency, and reducing acidity in the cocoa, what you're doing is you're allowing all these other flavors that are hidden by the astringency, the acidity, and the bitterness to be able to be represented in the finished chocolate.
I learned that bitterness is the worst thing to hide away flavors. Bitterness is the worst.
So, all right, in the sense that it has the greatest impact on the perception of other flavors.
If I take away the bitterness, the other flavors come up.
All right. That's great. So Bertus, I know that one of the things that you wanted to do before we left today is to talk about your book, right? And so so I don't know what you wanted to say about this book, but I do want to remind people that if you go to the post for this episode, there is a link where you can download the book. So just click on this link, save it to your local hard drive, and you will have a copy of the book. But please tell us about the book.
The book is 50% pulp, and pulp from Peru, from cocoa that the Incas ate. Nobody of you knows that the Incas ate cocoa, but they ate the cocoa that I studied for pulp. Then the rest is anima and some other mysterious things that cocoa presented to me. The subtitle is Magic of Reality. That's how I feel cocoa is. And I'm also call it the New Testament for fine cocoa.
All right. I think that's very interesting. Quickly before we go, Bertus, Thomas, who hopefully is still in the audience, asks, do you practice cacao ceremonies? Are you familiar with what cacao ceremonies are?
Yes.
Do you personally participate in a cacao ceremony using your cacao?
My good niece in Holland is organizing ceremonies. I sent her a kilogram of my cocoa. Here in Brazil, in Rio, I get a lot of demand now to work with anima, to make drinks also. Drinks. I don't know the ceremony exactly. I had never participated, but it seems very good for drinking.
Well, so all ceremonies, so there are a couple of things about ceremonial cacao, and this actually might be an entry into the marketplace, is that ceremonial cacao talks about using specific varieties, right? But it talks about under-processing it in order to maintain the original chemistry of the cocoa beans. And then what you're going to do is you're going to grind the cocoa beans into a liquor, and then you're going to use that cocoa mass to create a beverage. And that there is a ceremony which could be more traditional or more new agey, depending upon what you're doing it. But it's all about creating intention. I'm sitting down. I'm using the cocoa as a part of meditative or focused practice.
Must be very bitter.
But some people would say that's natural, right? You and I know that doesn't have to be, right? And so I'm just very, very curious about it. But we'll follow up on that. So that's all the questions that we had for today. We've addressed all of them. And then what I do want to let everybody know who runs into this episode beforehand or afterwards is go to TheChocolateLife.com, right? So here is the post for today's episode. You'll find links for resources. So Bertus, you gave me this presentation. I only showed one slide from it. Do I have your permission to share this as well? So
anybody,
it will.
Anybody,
okay, so
the book and.
Okay, so I will create a PDF of your presentation and add it to the post this afternoon so that people can get to that. I'm also going to be putting your email address in this post, right? So that if people want to contact you about understanding the anima process or the tratema process and incorporating it into your post-harvest, that they'll be able to speak with you and have a chance to talk about doing that. And I have some other ideas that could be interesting as well about that. And listen, Bertus, I think that when we talk about reimagining fermentation, I am a firm believer, as you are, that most people, there's always a risk that's being taken when you try to change the way things have been done for hundreds of years. There is a risk there, right? And you talk about think outside the box. And while I think that that's one way to think about it, there is a new age guru by the name of Deepak Chopra. And what he said, it's not enough to think outside the box. You need to throw the box away, right? Right. But my version of that is it's not enough to think outside the box. You need to forget what boxes are. And when I think about what it is that you've done, you've forgotten what the box is. You're just like, there's no such thing as a box, right? And I'm just going to go take a look at fermentation and say, can it be done? Why are we doing it the way, right, our great grandparents did it, right? Right. And it is through that examination, like tossing out the common wisdom, right, that what you've been able to do is you've been able to suggest that there is a different way to go about doing it. And I think that's really, really valuable, right? That what we want is lots of different methods of achieving different goals, not coalescing around a single way to do things. Because a monoculture of cacao trees is bad. A monoculture of the same crop is a bad idea. Right. But I think also more importantly, monocultures of ideas are just as bad. And so for me, this discussion today, the discussion leading up to today has been all around this. How do we throw the box away? Right. And what are we going to go to mix things up and say we need lots of new ideas in the mix, literally
I still need a box to ferment anima.
But I can do it in a 5-gallon bucket. I can do it in an 18-liter bucket. I don't need a box. I can do it in a bunch of different ways. So, it's just fascinating to me. I'm hoping that at some point I have an opportunity to visit with you, maybe in the Ivory Coast, maybe someplace else, and actually see it in action, see the process, and understand for myself the flavor differences, how flavor evolves over time. Right, from the fresh bean straight out of the pod and the pulp, right, through the process of fermentation into the finished chocolate. And I think
you get very, very surprised. Cocoa imitates 40 different flavors.
I hope so.
One of the flavor, do you know that cocoa imitates garlic?
All flavor is chemistry, right? And so if the chemicals which you associate with garlic flavor, so in the allicin, I believe if they are present in any way, then we should be able to express garlic flavors in cocoa. That wouldn't surprise me at all.
But now I understand why it imitates garlic, because mole in Mexico uses garlic.
Okay.
The mole?
Yeah, of course. But we were talking specifically about mole poblano from Puebla. Yeah. Right, garlic is a part of this, because that's the only one of the traditional Mexican moles with chocolate in it that also have garlic. But But yeah, I mean, again, listen. I mean, this is a set of conversations that we can have, right, and just go on forever. But we are limited to some extent by time. I want to thank, number one, Bertus, I want to thank you for joining me today, for being open and sharing what it is that you have shared with me. I'm going to go update the post, everybody, as I have mentioned, so that you can download these resources. Again, that'll be later this afternoon when I do that, in the next couple of hours. And I want to thank everybody who is a member of the Chocolate Life. Because this episode of Pod Safe Chocolate, like all episodes of Pod Safe Chocolate, is in fact sponsored by members of the Chocolate Life. This is the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. You can go click on a little green button up here. I'm logged in, so it says account. Yours will say join. There's always a free membership. If you do have some financial resources where you can support the work I'm doing, I won't say no. Thank you very much. Don't take advertising. I'm not doing Patreon or anything like that. It's your support as a member that helps keep this on the air every month. Bertus, I want to invite you back at some point. Perhaps we can dive into some of the other things we didn't get a chance to talk to today. But until then, what I want to do is remind everybody, as I do at the end of every episode, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Until the next time, everybody, ciao.